The sun was doing that golden, late afternoon thing it does in early September in Georgia, the kind that makes everything look like it was dipped in warm honey and left to dry. I sat behind the wheel of my silver Accord for a moment too long, engine still ticking, hands resting flat against my thighs. The Whitmore Grand Estate stretched out in front of me like something out of a movie, white columns, cascading flower arrangements in ivory and blush, a string quartet playing somewhere beyond the manicured hedges, and what had to be 300 guests already making their way across the lawn in their finest clothes. It was, by any standard, a spectacular wedding. My brother Caleb's wedding, to be exact, and I, his older sister Eleanor, was sitting in a rented car in the overflow parking lot, staring at a text message on my cracked phone screen like it might bite me. Before I go any further with this story, I just want to say, if this is already pulling you in, please hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know if you're in Atlanta like Eleanor or halfway across the world. Now, let's get back to that parking lot because things are about to go sideways real fast. The message had come from my cousin Daphne, who I always said had the biggest heart and the loosest lips in the entire Whitmore family. She meant well. She always meant well. But meaning well doesn't always soften the blow when someone drops a bomb on you via a 3:47 p.m. text message while you're 20 minutes away from a wedding venue. The message read, "Ellie, I don't know if anyone told you, but the seating got rearranged. Just brace yourself when you get there, okay? And maybe don't make a scene. You know how your mom gets." That was it. No explanation. No context. Just a lit fuse and a wink emoji that felt more like a warning than a joke. I read it twice, then a third time. Then I put the phone face down on the passenger seat and breathed through my nose for a solid 30 seconds the way my therapist had taught me. In for 4 counts, out for 6. In for 4, out for 6. It didn't help much, but it kept me from driving back down the highway and never showing up at all. Let me back up and give you the full picture, because none of what happened that day makes sense without the years that came before it. My name is Eleanor Renee Whitmore. I'm 34 years old, a licensed civil engineer who spent the better part of a decade building a career from scratch in a field where women, especially Black women, are expected to fight twice as hard for half the credit. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, in a house where love was real, but also deeply, painfully conditional. My parents, Charles and Vera Whitmore, were good people in a general, abstract kind of way. They fed us, clothed us, sent us to decent schools. But if you looked beneath the surface of that house on Magnolia Lane, you'd find something that nobody in my family ever talked about directly: a ranking system, a quiet, persistent, bone-deep favoritism that ran through everything like a crack in a foundation wall. Caleb was the favorite. That was just a fact, like gravity or tax season. He was the youngest, the only son, and from the time he could walk, my mother treated him like he was made of something more precious than the rest of us. My older sister Diane and I were loved, in theory, but Caleb was adored. Caleb got the car on his 16th birthday. Diane and I took the bus. Caleb got the college fund. I took out loans and worked weekends at a Cracker Barrel to pay for my textbooks. Caleb got the benefit of the doubt. Always, in every argument, every misunderstanding, every moment where it would have been fair to hold him accountable for something. We got the short end of the stick so consistently that we stopped expecting anything different. You know how they say you can get used to almost anything? Well, we got used to it. What I never got used to, though, was being erased. Because favoritism is one thing, but erasure is something else entirely. There's a difference between being loved less and being treated like you're barely there. And somewhere between my childhood and that parking lot in September, the scale had tipped fully from the first into the second. I had spent years trying to keep my footing in this family, showing up to every birthday, every holiday, every graduation, every milestone, even when it cost me, even when the invitations came late, even when my contributions were never acknowledged, even when my seat at the table felt more like a courtesy than a right. And I had shown up to this wedding with something that cost more than just money. Tucked in the back seat of my car, wrapped in pearl white satin ribbon with a handwritten card, was an envelope containing a cashier's check for $6,000. $6,000 that I had set aside over 14 months, pulling back on vacations, skipping concerts, eating at home instead of out, because Caleb was my brother. And despite everything, I still believed in showing up with your whole chest when family needed you. I had also coordinated the delivery of a hand-carved mahogany keepsake box, custom engraved with Caleb and Simone's wedding date, and a verse from 1 Corinthians. That had run me another $800 and required a special order from a craftsman in Charleston. I had done all of this willingly, gladly, because that's the kind of woman I was, or had been, up until the moment I read Daphne's text. I pulled the envelope from my bag and held it for a second. Then I tucked it carefully into my purse, straightened my dress, a deep emerald wrap dress that I had taken in for alterations specifically for this day, and got out of the car. The gravel crunched under my heels. Somewhere across the lawn, a woman laughed, and the sound carried on the warm air like something bright and careless. I squared my shoulders. I was going in. The entrance to the Whitmore Grand Estate was everything a wedding planner's portfolio fantasizes about. White iron archways draped in wisteria and eucalyptus framed a cobblestone path that led to the main pavilion. There were ice sculptures. There were champagne towers. There were young men in fitted tuxedos moving through the crowd with silver trays of hors d'oeuvres, looking like they had been hired specifically because they had good cheekbones. The whole setup must have cost 6 figures. Easy. Caleb's new in-laws, the Beaumont family from Charleston, had money the way some people have opinions, loudly and at all times. Their daughter Simone was lovely, genuinely lovely, and I had no quarrel with her at all. This was never about Simone. This was about something that had been building in the Whitmore family for over 30 years, and this wedding was simply the moment it finally boiled over. I picked up my name card from the welcome table near the entrance. A young woman in a cream blazer smiled at me as I stated my name. She rifled through the alphabetized cards, found mine, and handed it over with that professional, practiced warmth that event staff learn. I thanked her and looked down at the card in my hand. The name was right. Eleanor R. Whitmore. The table number was there. But below my name, printed in a slightly smaller but unmistakably legible font, were 2 words that made the blood in my veins run ice cold. I stood very still for a moment, the way you do when something happens that your brain genuinely hasn't figured out how to process yet. Non-priority guest. At my brother's wedding, I was at table 19, according to the card. I didn't need to look at the seating chart displayed on the easel near the pavilion entrance to know that table 19 was about as far from the head table as you could get without being seated outside. But I looked anyway. Table 1 through table 6 were reserved for immediate family, wedding party, and close friends. My mother, Vera, was at table 1. My Aunt Patricia and her husband were at table 2. My cousin Marcus, who Caleb had seen maybe 4 times in his adult life, was at table 4. I was at table 19, between a college acquaintance of Simone's and a co-worker of the groom's father who had apparently met Caleb twice. I don't know how long I stood there reading the chart. Long enough that one of the ushers, a young man in a white tuxedo jacket, stepped gently toward me and asked if I needed help finding my seat. I told him no. I told him I was fine. And then I smiled, because that's what you do when your insides are on fire and the world doesn't need to know about it yet. I found my seat at table 19 and sat down quietly. The table was lovely, of course. Everything here was lovely, but there was a particular sting to being surrounded by strangers at your own brother's wedding. The woman to my left introduced herself as Priya, a college roommate of Simone's. She was sweet and chatty, and had no idea that the woman sitting next to her was conducting a silent internal war between the part of herself that wanted to just get through the evening gracefully, and the part that had been pushed one time too many and was very close to her absolute limit. It was during the cocktail hour that my mother found me. Vera Whitmore was 61 years old, still sharp as a tack, dressed in a champagne-colored mother-of-the-groom suit that she had told me cost over $2,000. She swept through the crowd the way she always did, like she owned the room, like every head was turning for her, like the world had been organized with her comfort in mind. When she spotted me at table 19, she didn't look surprised. She looked something more uncomfortable. She looked like someone who had already decided how this conversation was going to go. Eleanor, you made it. Not, Eleanor, you look beautiful. Not, Eleanor, I'm so glad you're here. Just, you made it. Like I was a package that had been delivered on time against expectations. Of course I made it, Mom, I said, keeping my voice level. Why wouldn't I? She gave a small, practiced smile, the one she used when she was about to say something she had already rehearsed. Seating was tight. The Beaumonts had a long list, and Caleb wanted to make sure his closest people were comfortable. You understand. His closest people. I let that sit for a second. I turned the phrase over slowly in my mind like a stone I had just picked up, looking for whatever was underneath it. His closest people, I repeated quietly. I'm his sister, Mom. I know that, Eleanor. Her tone had that texture it always had when she was trying to manage me, soft on the surface, hard underneath. But you know how things are. You've been busy. You haven't been around as much. Caleb felt, she paused, choosing her words, that the people who had been more present in his daily life deserved the priority seats. I looked at my mother for a long moment. There were 1,000 things I could have said, 1,000 receipts I could have pulled out, metaphorically speaking. Every holiday I had driven 4 hours to attend, every birthday gift sent without so much as a thank you text, every phone call that went unanswered for days. But I didn't say any of it. Not yet. Instead, I said very quietly, is that what the place card label means? Non-priority guest. Something shifted in her eyes. Just slightly. That's just a logistical term. The event coordinator used it for the seating tiers. It's printed on my card, I said, by my name. She looked away, took a small sip of her champagne. Don't make this bigger than it is, Eleanor. Just enjoy the evening. And with that, she was gone, drifting back toward table 1, toward the warm light and the champagne and the people who mattered more. I watched her go. My chest felt like someone had reached into it with both hands and pulled in opposite directions. I had heard the phrase, don't make this bigger than it is, from my mother more times than I could count. It was her go-to phrase for every situation in which she had done something unkind and didn't want to be held responsible for it. Don't make this bigger than it is was the thing she said when I cried after watching Caleb get a brand new bicycle and receiving a hand-me-down one with a bent wheel. It was the thing she said when she introduced Caleb at her church's family Sunday and forgot to mention Diane and me until someone asked. It was the phrase that had slowly, over the course of my entire life, taught me that my feelings were always, reliably, too much for this family to hold. I sat back down at table 19 and picked up my glass of water. Priya, bless her heart, was now talking about the catering, something about whether the crab cakes were made with real lump crab or imitation, and I nodded along on autopilot while my mind worked through what was happening. I thought about the cashier's check in my purse, $6,000, 14 months of discipline and sacrifice. I thought about the mahogany keepsake box that had been delivered to the venue that morning. I had confirmed its arrival with the event coordinator 2 days ago. I thought about all the other gifts sitting at the gift table near the entrance, wrapped boxes and elegant cards and envelopes stacked neatly on white tablecloths, each one representing someone who had made the priority guest list. I was still sitting in that complicated silence when my Aunt Patricia appeared. Patricia was my mother's older sister, a woman who had never met a family drama she wasn't happy to stir. She slid into the empty chair beside me with a sympathetic smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sweetie, how are you holding up?" "I'm fine, Aunt Patricia. I saw the seating situation. I want you to know I had nothing to do with that. That was all your mother and Caleb." She said it with the particular relish of someone who enjoys watching fires from a safe distance. I looked at her steadily. Who else knew? She tilted her head. "Honey, most of the family knew the seating was arranged a certain way. I assumed someone had talked to you." "No one talked to me." She had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Well, Caleb and Simone made the decisions together. I think Simone's family had a lot of influence over who sat where. And your mother, you know how she is, Eleanor. She didn't want to rock the boat." "Didn't want to rock the boat," I repeated slowly, by not telling her own daughter that she had been labeled a non-priority guest at her brother's wedding. Patricia opened her mouth, closed it again, and then patted my hand in that useless way people do when they know they're on the wrong side of something but don't want to say so out loud. "Just try to enjoy the day, sweetheart." There it was again. Enjoy the day. Don't make this bigger than it is. You understand. The whole chorus of phrases this family used to make sure I never actually dealt with anything real. I smiled at Patricia. I thanked her. And she floated away, back toward her table, back toward the people who had earned their place in the warm light. I excused myself to use the restroom. It was a beautiful restroom. Of course it was. All white marble and fresh flowers in crystal vases, soft lighting that made everyone look like they were in a perfume commercial. I stood at the sink and looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. The woman looking back at me had done everything right. She had worked hard. She had shown up. She had not burned bridges when she had every reason to. She had spent $6,000 on a man who had labeled her a non-priority and sat her at the back of his wedding like a distant acquaintance. She had not complained. She had not demanded recognition. She had simply, quietly continued to love people who had never quite gotten around to loving her back with the same effort. And standing there in that marble bathroom, something in me shifted. I don't mean something dramatic. There was no sudden rage, no trembling hands, no cinematic breakdown. It was quieter than that. It was more like a door closing gently, but with absolute finality. Like the last reasonable part of me that had still been waiting for this family to choose me had simply looked around, seen the evidence clearly, and stepped back from the window. I took a slow breath. I looked at myself for one more beat, and then I opened my purse, took out my phone, and sent a message to the event coordinator, whose number I still had from confirming the keepsake box delivery. The message said, "Hi, this is Eleanor Whitmore. I need to step outside for a moment. Could you hold the mahogany keepsake box I delivered this morning? Don't put it on the gift table just yet. I need to speak with you briefly." Her response came in less than 2 minutes. "Of course, Miss Whitmore. I have it in the coordination room. Just come find me whenever you're ready." I straightened the neckline of my emerald dress, reapplied my lipstick, and walked out of the restroom with my head up. Back in the main hall, the ceremony was still an hour away. The guests were mingling, the string quartet had shifted into something more upbeat, and the afternoon light was doing beautiful things through the estate's tall windows. I moved through the crowd with the calm purposefulness of a woman who has just decided something. I stopped by the gift table. My eyes found the elegant stack of envelopes and wrapped presents, and I reached into my purse. The cashier's check was in its envelope, still sealed, with my handwritten note attached to the front. "With love and every good wish, Eleanor." I looked at it for a moment. Then I removed the note. I folded it neatly and tucked it back into my purse. And I kept the envelope too. Non-priority guest. Okay, fine. Non-priority guests don't leave priority level gifts. I went to find the event coordinator. Her name was Tamara, a focused, professional woman in a black pantsuit with a headset looped over one ear. She found me near the side entrance and led me down a short hallway to a small, neatly organized coordination room that smelled like fresh flowers and good organizational skills. The mahogany keepsake box sat on a side table, wrapped beautifully, the engraving detail visible through the clear protective film on the lid. I picked it up. It was heavier than I remembered. Solid. Real. The way the things I put effort into always were. "Is everything okay?" Tamara asked carefully. "Everything is fine," I said. "I just need to take this back with me. There's been a change of plans." She nodded once, the nod of a professional who has seen enough wedding day family complications to write a book, and made a small note on her clipboard without asking another question. I appreciated that more than she knew. I walked back through the hallway and out a side door to the parking area. The afternoon air was thick with honeysuckle and the distant sound of laughter. I set the box carefully in the back seat of my car. Then I stood there for a moment with my hand flat against the car door, breathing in the warm September air, letting myself feel the full weight of what was happening. Not just what had happened today, but the whole long thread of it, the years of showing up and being quietly sidelined, the years of investing in people who never matched my energy, the years of telling myself that love meant giving without expectations. All of that was true, but there's a difference between giving freely and allowing yourself to be taken for granted. There's a line between unconditional love and self-erasure. And I had been standing on the wrong side of it for a very long time. I went back inside. I returned to table 19. I smiled at Priya and accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray and sat through the cocktail hour like a woman who had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. Because that's exactly what I was. When my brother Caleb finally made his way through the reception room with Simone on his arm, both of them glowing, both of them beautiful, both of them surrounded by a bubble of pure celebration, he spotted me and walked over. We hadn't spoken in 3 months. Not because of a fight, just because of the slow, mutual drift of two people who had never quite figured out how to know each other as adults. "Ellie, you're here." He gave me a hug that lasted about a second and a half. The kind of hug that checks a box. "I'm here," I said. "Table 19, right? Hope you found it okay." I looked at him for a beat. He wasn't being mean. That was the thing about Caleb that had always been the hardest to process. He was never mean exactly. He was just oblivious in the way that people are oblivious when they've been allowed to be all their lives. When no one ever made them accountable, when every room always rearranged itself for their comfort, when they had grown up believing that the people around them would simply adjust. He wasn't cruel. He just hadn't been taught to see me. I found it. I said, "Congratulations, Caleb. Simone is beautiful. I hope you're happy." He grinned, that wide, easy Caleb Whitmore grin that had gotten him out of trouble his entire life. "Thanks, Ellie. It means a lot that you came." And then Simone was tugging his arm toward another group of guests, and he was gone again, back into the bright center of the room. I watched him go, and something strange happened. The hurt was still there. It would be for a while, but underneath it, I felt something new beginning to harden into its place. Not bitterness, not rage, something more clear-eyed than either of those. A decision, a direction, the quiet, determined voice of a woman who had finally run out of excuses to give the wrong people. I stayed for the ceremony. It was genuinely beautiful. Vows that made people cry, flowers that looked like a painting, Simone in a gown that deserved its own documentary. I sat at table 19, and I watched the people I loved from a distance. And I let myself feel every bit of the sadness that came with being on the outside of a family looking in. I didn't push it down. I didn't distract myself with small talk. I let it sit in my chest, hard and real, because that's the only way you ever actually process something. You have to feel it before you can move past it. At some point during the reception, my cousin Daphne found her way to my table. She slid into an empty seat, squeezed my hand, and looked at me with those warm, worried eyes of hers. "I'm so sorry, Ellie. I should have called you sooner. I only found out about the seating 2 days ago, and I didn't know how to—" "It's okay, Daph. It's not okay. It was humiliating, and it was wrong, and I told your mama so." I looked at her. "You told her?" "I absolutely did. You know what she said? She said, 'Eleanor knows how things work in this family.'" Daphne shook her head, jaw tight, like that's supposed to make it better. "Eleanor knows how things work in this family." I repeated it slowly, and somehow those words landed differently than anything else had that day. Because they were true. I didn't know how things worked in this family. I had always known. I had just spent 34 years hoping they might work differently. Tonight was the night I stopped hoping. I left before the cake cutting. I hugged Daphne. I said goodbye to no one else. I walked back across the cobblestones in my emerald dress, past the ice sculptures and the champagne towers and the string quartet that was now playing something slow and romantic. And I got into my car, the mahogany keepsake box, and the $6,000 cashier's check were in the back seat where I had put them. I started the engine. I pulled out of the overflow parking lot, and I drove away from the Whitmore Grand Estate into the warm Georgia night. What happened next is not the part of the story that involves a single dramatic moment. It's the part that involves months, that involves the quiet, unglamorous, deeply personal work of deciding who you want to be when the people you were raised to rely on have shown you clearly and repeatedly that you can't rely on them. It involves therapy, real therapy, the kind where you sit across from someone who doesn't have a stake in your family dynamics, and they say things that make you sit in your car afterward for 20 minutes processing. It involves journaling and long walks, and a lot of very intentional decisions about where your energy goes and why. I want to be straight with you here, because this story isn't one of those where the protagonist transforms overnight. It doesn't work that way, and if anyone tells you it does, They're selling something. What I did was slow. What I did was incremental. What I did was mostly internal. But the changes were real. In the 3 months after Caleb's wedding, I did a full accounting, not of money, but of energy. I made myself sit down and look honestly at every relationship in my life and ask 2 questions. What am I putting in? What am I getting back? Not because love has to be perfectly equal. It doesn't, but because there's a baseline of reciprocity that healthy relationships require, and I had been operating well below it for a long time with certain people. I had been giving my whole chest to folks who were offering me the back of their hand. That was going to change. I told my therapist, Dr. Anaya Brooks, about the wedding. All of it, the text, the parking lot, the place card, the conversation with my mother, the keepsake box in the back seat. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I valued most about her. Then she said something that I wrote down in my journal that night. Eleanor, the problem is not that your family doesn't love you. The problem is that you've been accepting the version of love they offer as though it's the only version available. It isn't. And you deserve more than the scraps of someone else's table. Scraps of someone else's table. I turned that phrase over for weeks, because that's exactly what it had been, hadn't it? My whole life in this family had been about sitting at the edges of someone else's feast and being grateful for what was left over. And I had done it with such grace, such reliability, such stubborn, aching dignity, because that's what you do when you love people, even people who don't always deserve it. But grace shouldn't cost you your self-respect. And it had been costing me for a long time. I threw myself into work, not as an escape. I want to be clear about the difference, but as a reclamation. My career had always been the one place where I knew exactly what I was worth, because the numbers didn't lie, and the bridges I built didn't fall down. I had been working for a mid-sized infrastructure firm in Atlanta for 4 years, doing solid work, getting decent reviews, but playing it safe, staying in my lane, not pushing for projects that felt above my reach, not advocating loudly for myself the way I probably should have been. The same habit that had kept me small in my family had followed me into the office. Be good enough to earn your seat, but never ask for anything more than what's offered. I decided to change that. I signed up for a leadership accelerator program offered by the Society of Women Engineers, something I had bookmarked over a year ago and kept finding reasons not to commit to. I started speaking up in meetings, offering analysis when I had something real to add, pushing back when project decisions didn't make structural sense. I applied for a senior project manager role that became available in February, a role I had previously talked myself out of pursuing because I assumed they'd want someone with more seniority. I had a meeting with my director, Clifton Reeves, a fair man who had told me more than once that he believed in my work. I told him directly that I was ready for more responsibility and I wanted to make a case for the promotion. He looked at me with something close to surprise, not because he doubted me, but because I had never asked before. Eleanor, he said, I've been waiting for you to say that for 2 years. I got the promotion in March. I also spent that period rebuilding, or more accurately, building for the first time a version of chosen family. I had been so fixated on the one I was born into that I had underinvested in the people I had chosen, my college friends Renata and Simone P., a different Simone, my Simone, who never once let me sit at the wrong table, my neighbor and running buddy Cassandra, my coworker, and close friend James, who brought me soup when I had the flu and made me laugh until I choked. These people were my real table. I just hadn't been sitting at it often enough. Daphne, too, grew into something more during that period. She had always been the family member I was closest to, but the wedding had stripped away some of the pretense and left something more honest in its place. She started calling me every Sunday, not out of obligation, but because she genuinely wanted to. She was my cousin by blood and my friend by choice, and that distinction started to matter more. I kept the mahogany box in my apartment for a while, sitting on the shelf in my home office, not as a reminder of the wedding, but as a reminder of the decision I had made that night, the moment I stopped letting sentiment override my self-worth. Every morning I walked past it, I remembered, you are allowed to take your gifts back when you realize they aren't wanted. Eventually, I found a better use for it. I had it re-engraved, the original date and names polished out, replaced with a simple botanical design, and gave it to Dr. Brooks as a retirement gift when she left her practice the following spring. She had given me something worth far more than $800. A keepsake box felt about right. The irony hit on a Tuesday morning, 14 months after Caleb's wedding, in the most mundane way that major life moments often do. I was on my second cup of coffee at the kitchen table, reviewing project notes on my laptop when my phone rang, an Atlanta area code I didn't immediately recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. It was Caleb. He opened with small talk, the weather, how he and Simone were settling in, how they had just adopted a dog named Biscuit. I listened. I was polite. And I waited for the thing he was actually calling about because Caleb, in my entire experience of knowing him, had never called to just chat. There was always a point. The point arrived after about 4 minutes of preamble. Ellie, I need to ask you something. And I want you to know I'm asking because I trust you and because honestly, you're the smartest person in this family when it comes to this kind of thing. Oh, interesting opener. I thought. He and Simone, it turned out, had invested a significant amount of money, wedding gift money, combined savings, a loan from Simone's parents, into a real estate development project managed by a man named Gerald Farrow, a friend of one of the Beaumont family cousins. The project had looked solid on paper. Returns promised at 18% annually. Exclusive residential development in a rapidly growing suburb. Professional presentation, legal-looking documentation. The whole 9 yards. By the time Caleb finished talking, I had already recognized the shape of what he was describing. Caleb, I said carefully, how much did you put in? A pause. Combined with the loan from Simone's parents, about $72,000. I closed my laptop, and the project. 3 months ago, Farrow stopped returning calls. His office phone is disconnected. The project website is down. His assistant told Simone's dad that the company is restructuring, but no one can reach anyone, and there's no construction activity at the site. We hired a lawyer, but she says without a clearer paper trail, it's going to be difficult to recover anything through civil court. There was silence on the line. Then quietly, I know I should have done more due diligence, Ellie. I know that, but I'm calling because you work in infrastructure and development. You know how these projects work. And we found some documents that we think might show Farrow was running something fraudulent, but we don't know how to read them or who to take them to. Mom said to call you. She said you would know what to do. Mom said to call you. I sat with that for a long moment. I felt many things simultaneously. I felt the quiet, sad irony of it, that the woman who had seated me at table 19 as a non-priority guest was now directing her favorite child to call me because she needed something I had. I felt the old pull of it, the ingrained instinct to just say yes, to show up, to be the one who fixes things, because that is what I had always done. I felt a flicker of something petty and human that I won't pretend wasn't there. And then I felt something cleaner rise to the top of all of it, perspective. Caleb was my brother. He was in real trouble, not just financially, but emotionally. He and Simone were newlyweds facing a potentially devastating loss. The man had made mistakes, both in the investment and in how he had handled his relationship with me, but he was not a bad person. He was a person who had been raised to take certain things for granted, and the world had just handed him a very hard lesson about what happens when you do. I did not swoop in. I did not offer to solve everything. And I did not perform forgiveness. I hadn't actually arrived at yet. What I did was tell him the truth. Caleb, I'm willing to look at those documents. But before I do, I need us to have a real conversation. Not about Pharaoh. About us. About the wedding. About the place card. About 14 years of me showing up for this family and being treated like an afterthought. I've been sitting on that for over a year. If you want my help, my real help, the kind where I put in actual time and expertise, then you owe me that conversation. And it has to be a real one. The silence that followed was the longest silence I had ever heard from Caleb. He was not a man accustomed to being told that something was owed to him. He was not practiced in the art of being held accountable by someone who loved him. I could feel him figuring out in real time how to be inside that feeling. Then he said, "Okay, you're right. I know you're right. Can we meet in person?" "Yes," I said, "we can." We met at a coffee shop in Midtown Atlanta on a Saturday morning 2 weeks later. Caleb showed up early, which surprised me. He was already at a corner table when I arrived, looking like a man who had spent 2 weeks figuring out what to say and was no longer sure any of it was enough. I sat down across from him and ordered a courte-du and looked at him and waited. He talked for almost 20 minutes without me interrupting. He talked about the place card. He said he had approved the seating tiers with the event coordinator because it was the language the planner used for managing the complicated logistics of a 300-person wedding, and that he had not thought clearly about what it would look like for me to be labeled that way. He said that was careless, and he was sorry. He talked about the seating. He admitted that he had told his mother to put the priority seats aside for the people he saw every day, and that he had not pushed back when she made the list and he noticed my name wasn't near the top. He said that was wrong, and he was sorry for that too. He talked haltingly about the years before the wedding, about how he knew, on some level, that things had not been equal between us growing up, and how he had never confronted it because it was easier not to. He said he didn't have a good excuse for that. He just had honesty, which he was offering now, late as it was. And then he said something that I had never, in 34 years of being his sister, expected to hear. He said, "I think I've been selfish, Ellie. I think I was raised to be in ways I didn't fully understand, and I've let it hurt you in ways I'm only starting to see. I'm not asking you to forget that. I'm asking you to let me try to be better." I looked at my brother for a long moment. This was not the easy version of forgiveness, the kind that wraps everything up neatly and pretends the wound was never there. This was something more complicated and more real. I didn't tell him everything was fine. I told him that I heard him. I told him that accountability was a start, not an ending. I told him that what I wanted more than any apology was for him to carry this awareness forward, into how he treated me going forward, into how he talked about me to our mother, into the small daily choices that make up the actual texture of a family relationship. He nodded. He looked like a man who had just grown up about a decade in the span of a Saturday morning. I believed him, not because I was naive, but because I know what someone looks like when they are telling the truth and also scared of it. And that was what Caleb looked like right then. After that, we spent another 90 minutes going through the documents he had brought. I put on my professional hat, cool, analytical, systematic, and I went through the Pharaoh investment materials line by line. What I found was a carefully constructed fraud, fabricated LLC registrations, a project site that existed on paper but had never broken ground, financial statements that had been copied from a legitimate company and altered. I walked Caleb through exactly what to bring to the Securities and Exchange Commission's Investor Complaint Division and the Georgia Secretary of State's office. I connected him with a financial fraud attorney I had met through my professional network, a sharp woman named Celestine Marks who did not mess around. I didn't charge him for any of it, not because I was a doormat. I want to be very clear about that distinction, but because this was genuine help given from a place of genuine choice, which is entirely different from help given out of obligation or fear of disappointing someone. I knew the difference now. I had paid for that knowledge the hard way. Celestine Marks was, as advertised, extraordinary. Within 6 weeks, she had identified 3 other victims of Pharaoh's scheme and had assembled a civil fraud complaint with enough supporting evidence to get law enforcement interested. The case moved faster than any of us expected. Gerald Pharaoh was arrested in January. The criminal case was ongoing, but Celestine had already secured a partial asset freeze that put a significant portion of the investor's money within potential recovery range. It was not a guaranteed full recovery. Fraud cases rarely are, but it was a fighting chance, which was far more than Caleb had had when he called me that Tuesday morning. My mother called me 3 weeks after the arrest made a small piece of the local news. Not about the case, about me. Vera Whitmore had apparently heard through the family grapevine that I had been the one to help Caleb navigate the situation, and she called on a Wednesday evening while I was in the middle of making dinner. The conversation started with her usual warm but careful tone, the one she used when she wanted something or was bracing herself for something. She asked about my job, about my apartment, about whether I was seeing anyone. I answered simply, honestly, giving nothing extra. And then she said what she had called to say. Eleanor, I want to talk to you about the wedding. I've been thinking about it. I'm listening. I said, I think the way things were handled, the seating, and that label on your card wasn't fair to you. I should have said something. I should have made sure you were treated properly. And I didn't. That was wrong of me. There it was. Not exactly a full accounting. Not quite the depth of conversation I had had with Caleb. But it was my mother. And for Vera Whitmore, this was as close to a direct apology as I had heard in my entire life. I knew how much it cost her. I knew how many times she had replayed the situation before she could bring herself to say those words. I understood that, and it mattered. Thank you for saying that, Mom, I said, and I meant it. I also want to say, she continued, her voice slightly less certain now, that I haven't always shown you clearly how much you mean to me. You've always been the strong one, the capable one, and I think sometimes I assumed that meant you didn't need the same things the others needed. That was wrong. Children need their mother to see them, not just to rely on them. I sat down on my couch. The dinner was still simmering on the stove. Outside my window, Atlanta was doing its evening thing. Traffic sounds, distant music, the city breathing. I pressed my hand against my chest and let myself feel the tenderness of what was happening. This was not the resolution of everything. This was not the end of the complicated history between Vera Whitmore and her oldest daughter. But it was something. It was a beginning of something more honest. And after 34 years of waiting for honesty, I was willing to meet it where it was. I hear you, Mom, I said, and I want you to know I love you. That hasn't changed, but I need things to be different going forward. I need to actually be seen by this family, not just called on when something needs to be fixed. I need to be invited to the table as a full member of it, not an afterthought. Can you hear me saying that? A long pause. Then quietly, yes, I can hear you. We talked for another 30 minutes. By the end, there were no neat bows tied, no promises of perfection, no sudden transformation of 30 years of family patterns into something glossy and resolved. But there was honesty. There was acknowledgement. There was the first real, unguarded conversation my mother and I had ever had where neither of us was performing anything. That was worth more than any apology, more than any table seat, more than anything I could have demanded or manipulated into existence. It was earned. We had both earned it. Summer came, and with it a family gathering at my Aunt Patricia's house in Savannah, the annual cookout that the Whitmore family had been holding every July since before I was born. I almost didn't go. Old habits have deep roots, and the habit of protecting yourself from places that have hurt you is not easily unlearned. But Daphne called and said she needed me there, and Caleb texted and said he hoped I'd come, and something in me decided that running from the table was no longer my answer. I would show up. I would show up differently. The cookout was the same as it had always been. Patricia's backyard full of folding chairs and card tables, the smell of ribs on the grill, kids running through the sprinkler, someone's playlist going through the speaker in the kitchen window. It was loud and messy and alive in the way that big family gatherings always are, for better or worse. The moment that mattered most happened simply. Caleb was setting up extra chairs around the main table, a big picnic table under the oak tree that had always been the center of family gatherings. And he looked up when I came through the back gate. He waved. And then he did something he had never done before at a family event. He pulled out the chair directly next to his closest to the center and patted the seat. "Come on, Ellie, sit here." It was a small thing. It was just a chair. But I want you to understand what that chair meant, what it represented after a lifetime of sitting at table 19, of being the non-priority, of adjusting to the edges. It meant that my brother saw me now. It meant that something had shifted, not just in a single apology, but in the quiet, ongoing fabric of how this family would operate going forward. I walked across that backyard, and I sat down in that chair. Patricia made a toast. Daphne laughed at something and spilled lemonade on herself. My mother caught my eye across the table and smiled. A real one, no performance, no management in it, just a mother looking at her daughter. I smiled back, and I thought about everything that had gotten me to that chair. The parking lot, the place card, the marble bathroom, the back seat of my car with the keepsake box and the cashier's check, the therapy sessions and the Sunday phone calls and the promotion, the coffee shop conversation and the fraud documents and Celestine marks and 67 months of compound interest on the $6,000 I had never given away, which was now sitting in a high-yield savings account earmarked for a down payment on a house. That would be entirely, completely, unambiguously mine. The revenge, if you want to call it that, had never been about making anyone suffer. It had never been about a dramatic confrontation or a public takedown or a single satisfying moment where I got to watch someone's face fall. Real revenge, the kind that heals you instead of just hurting them, is quieter than that. It looks like a woman walking out of a parking lot with her dignity intact. It looks like taking back what you gave to people who labeled you as less than. It looks like 14 months of choosing yourself day after day in small invisible ways until the choice becomes a reflex and the reflex becomes a self, and the self is someone you are genuinely proud of. It looks like a chair at the center of the table, and it looks like sitting down in it and knowing in your bones, in your chest, in the still small place where your truest self lives, that you were always worth that seat, that you never stopped being worth it, not even in the hardest years, not even in the parking lots and the marble bathrooms and the long drives home, that the label on the place card was never the truth of you. It was only the truth of whoever put it there. I am Eleanor Renee Whitmore, Senior Project Manager, sister, daughter, friend, woman who knows her own worth. And I have never once in my life been a non-priority guest. I was just waiting for the room to catch up. The place card said non-priority, but I left that label in the parking lot where it belonged and walked into the rest of my life with both hands free. Thank you so much for listening to Eleanor's story. If this hit close to home, if you've ever been seated at the wrong table by people who should have known better, drop a comment below and tell me about it. I read every single one. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Hit the like button if Eleanor's journey moved you. And most importantly, go be your own priority today. See you in the next one.